Welcome to the Birding Life podcast. My name is Adam, and I'm your host on the podcast where we discover birds and the birders that pursue them. The Birding Life is proud to be associated with Swarovski Optic, one of the world's leading producers of binoculars, and spotting scopes, as well as the Bird Lasser bird logging app. Spot, plot, play a part. Download and install the app to play your part in social conservation. The Birding Life is a lot more than just a podcast. It's a multi-platform resource to connect birders with each other, amazing locations, the best resources, and obviously where to find amazing birds. Head on over to our website www.thebirdinglife.com and be sure to sign up to our newsletter on the site so you do not miss out on any of the exciting things that are coming up. Be sure to follow this podcast on whatever platform you're listening to it on, and please take some time to rate and comment on it. So this is episode 27 of the podcast, and in this episode I chat to James Rawdon all about bird ringing, or as our overseas listeners call it, bird banding. I just want to apologize for the poor audio quality in this episode. We recorded this outside. There was a strong wind and a noisy power line overhead, but I feel that the content is great and worth a listen. So without further ado, here's the interview with James. So yeah, James, bumped into you at Cumberland, and we came here to do some YouTube stuff with the guys from Cumberland, and just bumped into you. It's all just good to have a chat to you. Saw you doing ringing, had a whole lot of like really cool equipment and that type of thing. We thought you actually had to do our COVID test. We were a little bit worried when we arrived, but yeah. So it's a little bit for those who are listening. It's a little bit windy. This is the first time we are doing a live on the field podcast episode, so I'm really excited about this, and it's also going to be going on YouTube. So James, just before we talk about the ringing, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? And I'm always interested in why birds? How did you get into birds? I mean, these are, everyone likes we talk about the sexy animals, lions and cheetahs and that. Why birds? What made you interested in birds?
Well, it's funny you say that, the lions and the cheetahs and things. My background was in wildlife. I studied zoology at the University of Natal in Pietermaritzburg, and from there went up and did guiding in Mala, and then up with wilderness safaris in Botswana for 6 years. And there did some studies on the lions, and then eventually decided to, settle down, start a family, and left the bush, and then missed the whole outdoors and the research, and decided to try and find something closer to home that we could do. And the bird ringing, I started joining a guide out of Durban, Garth Aston, and we would ring once a month or so, and then he trained me over, I'd say 1.5 to 2 years. To do the bird ringing, and that's it's wonderful to get out actually to amazing places, meet like-minded people, and and that's how I've always done birding right from teenager. So birds was just the natural way to go, and something I could do close to home with the kids.
So what's your earliest birding memory? What is that moment that hooked you as a birder? Was there a defining moment, or was it just something that happened? What are some memories from growing up as a birder?
I can probably remember it at about 13 years of age, in Salt Rock in Natal, walking to a friend's house before it was all built up, and seeing this beautiful little bright yellow and green bird, a little beater.
Oh, that's awesome.
And that stuck out in the memories, and I think from then I always just paid attention to what was around, and onto a pair of binoculars, and so it grew from there.
And your any favorite birds?
Gosh, difficult one. I think it's the raptors and owls are always special, but I think the ringing has opened up a whole new sort of window to it. It's seeing the LBJs and getting them in the hand, and seeing the ID features on all the cysticlers. Like this morning, we caught the Nediki and the croaking and the lazy cysticlers, and just seeing them up close. But there's favourites from the kingfishers and the pretty ones, the bee-eaters.
And I know we're at Cumberland this weekend. I mean, if you haven't been at Cumberland, this place is spectacular. But what would you say is your number one birding spot? If you were able, we went in the middle of all this crazy season, you were able to travel anywhere and do some birding, where would you be traveling?
Gosh, well, this is certainly one of them. We haven't been able to get up here this year, so it was as soon as they opened up. With first people into the rooms again. So this is a definite highlight. And then Zululand. I spent a lot of time doing the ringing and birding up in Zululand. The Pinde area, Mfolozi, Shishlui, up into Tembe. That's always fantastic.
Okay, so let's chat about this ringing. We came here, we arrived here, there were a whole lot of nets along the sides, like meters and meters of nets, and you're sitting out like there's a box with a whole little rings in, pliers, a scale, some paperwork. So how does the ringing process look? So you arrive here, what does a day of ringing look like on a practical level?
All right, so firstly important is to get the landowner's permission. So they've been ringing here for probably about 15 years through the university in Pietermaritzburg. And then a friend of mine was ringing here, but he's left the area, so I took over this site. So firstly, getting the permission and then getting to know the area a bit to choose your sites. So the habitats, try and sample the different habitats. So you get here, first thing is to see where you're going to put the nets, the vegetation. As you can see, quite a few thorn trees and things. You don't want to get your nets damaged, and so select the sites, and then you start putting up the nets. A lot of people will put the nets up early in the morning before you do your ringing session. We tend to do it where we can the afternoon before. It just allows us the time to put up as many nets as we want and see what you're doing properly. So we'll put the nets up. Depending if it's just myself, I'll put up fewer nets. Because you want to put up the number of nets that you can manage and the number of birds you're getting in the area.
Just before coming there, when I looked at the nets, they don't look that easy to put up. How do you actually put these nets up?
So it's usually it's myself and Laura, who's also a trained ringer. It helps having two people. So you start. You put the stake in the ground. You put a pole up. Then you put the loops from the net onto the pole, and then you'll unravel the net. You've got your own way of folding it up so they don't get knotted. And one person stays that side, and you unravel it, hammer in a stake the other side when you get to the right length. The nets are between, so I've got 12, 15 and 18 meter nets, and I think today we've got up about close to 300 to 400 meters.
Sure.
So it's a lot of nets, but we know we're not going to get the huge numbers like we would at, say, Sappy Stanger. Here we might get anything 30 to 60 birds. So it's a manageable number that we can process before it gets too hot or too windy, and because again our priority is the safety of the birds, that no harm comes to them.
Okay, then beyond, so you put the nets up, what happens beyond that there now?
So because we do it in the afternoon before, we put the nets up, and then we put the poles right up high, and we furl the nets. We close the nets up so nothing gets caught overnight, and then in the morning when we come out, we come before it gets light, so the birds don't know the nets are there. This morning, 5:15, we started opening up, and then the nets are all open. So once the birds start their morning chorus and starting to get active, then they'll start flying into the nets.
And then I saw there's a whole lot of information you gather here. So now you get the birds out the nets. Just talk us. You're explaining how you're explaining when the bird's in the net. How do you get the bird out? Because let me jump to this first, because there might be people who actually have this question straight away. For some people, ringing is a little bit controversial, and I know there's even people in conservation who are just against ringing. They're not for it. They talk about how it harms the birds. What would you say to those people who talk about the harm that this does? I mean, like if I look from an outsider's perspective, in the birds in the net, they have this it's like a different call. They're not happy to be in there. What would you be your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean certainly there's some stress involved. They don't want to be caught, but they are. But as you've seen from the nets, they're very soft nets. There's no harm done to the birds in the nets. We check the nets regularly. Again, depending on the weather, you don't want to do it in particularly windy conditions, hot or rainy. So you check the nets regularly. First of all, you get a lot of training in getting the birds out the net. That's the trickiest part of the bird ringing. So you will be assessed by 2 or 3 ringers before you are found competent. And it's not just about being able to do it, it's how you handle the birds. Do you take that care with them? All birds are different, whether you're doing a little nediki at 9 grams or you're doing a raptor or a taraka or something like that. So in terms of the birds, you very rarely get a bird injured. I'd say probably the highest risk would be from other predators, raptors, things like mongoose, Burchell's kukkel are particularly, if they're around, you want to be checking the nets regularly. But in terms of birds getting injured in the nets, very unlikely. We don't let anybody just come and help get the birds out the nets. It needs to be somebody who's got the training, or somebody that you are in the process of training and you hands-on supervising it. There's a whole technique behind it and how you start. You find the exposed belly and the legs. You start with the legs and so on. You work your way through it. You've got to have a lot of patience to be able to do it properly. You don't want to rush it or anything like that. But from doing the ringing in places over time, you keep coming back. You're catching those same birds again, birds that have got rings on them. If they were stressed or injured, you wouldn't be catching those birds again. And as we've seen today, releasing the birds, they'll often, you let them go here, and they fly straight to the closest tree. They're not often a panic, or some species make more noise than other species. That's just the nature of them. They'll squawk, and so again in the training they advise you to get at least 50 different species and up to 500 birds, because you want to experience handling birds with the different natures. So whether they're aggressive or they're particularly noisy, and others are more fragile, whether it's small sunbirds, that sort of thing, where you've got to be particularly careful. So I think from that point of view, that we do catch them again. They don't move out of the area to other, territorial birds in particular. We catch birds almost every time we come back to a site, and that could be over a 5, 6, 7 year period. So we wouldn't find that, we wouldn't get that data back. We wouldn't be catching them over and over if they were stressed, and you wouldn't do it, every day. You would, we'll every 2 or 3 months say we find that even that would be quite a lot, that would come back to the same sites. So we call it a constant effort cycle. You keep coming back because you want to get that data over time.
I know Andrew Pickle spoke about the thick-bill weaver, and he says they can nip you. So what are the more difficult and feisty birds to? Which bird? You love birds, or which birds do you kind of dread? I noticed earlier you guys were kind of fighting about certain birds. Like, now you handle that one there. Which birds are a little bit feisty?
Certainly the thick-billed weaver is one of the notorious ones. The shrike family. So the fiscal, probably one of my least favorite in the way of the bird it is, but in handling it, would be the grey-headed bushrat. That can take a bit of skin off when it attacks the fingers. But I'd say it's more when you're getting the birds out the net, where you might take a bite or two. During the actual ringing process, there's no need to get bitten. The way you're carefully holding it, you generally don't get bitten. But I like to get a record of each species at a site. Some people then again are against actually holding the birds for longer than need be. But with ringing, you've also got to look at it from another point of view, as the educational side, which is very important. A lot of the areas that we do it, whether it's just kids and families that come and join, or local people outside the reserves, and to actually bring those kids in and let them see the birds up close, and even to release the birds, like you each had a chance to release the birds today. It's quite a special experience to hold that bird, see it up close, and let it go free, and to see that these birds, they're not injured. They might call a distress call and that, but once they're gone, you can literally see them starting their day again and start feeding immediately. So from an education point of view, I find it personally worthwhile just to have a look at those birds, let people see them, and get that photograph. Whenever we ring at a site like this, we always supply a summary of the birds we've got, the data, as well as a photograph of every species. And they'll often use that on websites for promotional material and just awareness. It's that there's some research going on, and all that information is going back to UCT, to the University of Cape Town, and that's available for researchers, students to use in various projects. It's on our Roberts app. And
we have just launched the Birding Life YouTube account. We are looking forward to proudly showcasing Southern Africa's best birds, birding spots, and even the fascinating people that make up the world of birding. We already have 2 videos that have been posted, which showcase 2 of our favorite KZN birding spots. We'll post a link to the YouTube channel in the comment section of this podcast. Be sure to subscribe, and hit the notification bell to make sure you don't miss out on any of the great content that we'll be posting. We were chatting earlier, so like I said, there's a whole lot of, for those who are on the podcast, there's a whole lot of papers and little cool toolbox here. It's got a fly fishing box. So, what happens? So the bird you've got the bird out the net, and you put in like a little bag. You bring it here. What does the process look like? The administration part of it. What does that look like?
All right. So once we get it out the net, importantly, you put them each into their own bags, and the bags, they're just cotton bags. They're breathable. The birds actually are very relaxed and calm when they're in the bags. And then we'll, start with each bird. First thing you do is get the ring on the bird. They do occasionally escape, and you want to have that ring on. And then from there you start taking the measurements. We take weight. We measure the wing, the tail, the head and bill, the bill length, the molts. You can on the primaries, head molts. If there's a brood patch, if they're breeding. And then, it depends. Sometimes there are other projects that people are working on where blood samples are requested and things, but that you can only do with the necessary training and permits. It's not something that we would just do here. And then all that information, as I was saying, it goes into an Excel spreadsheet. So this week we'll process this, and then we upload it onto the UCT website, and it's available to other ringers or researchers.
And then in terms of the actual rings, we're having a look at the ring. You showed me the rings earlier. What information is actually contained in the ring? So when somebody looks at that ring, what exactly is on the ring?
So if a member of the public finds a ring, it says on the ring here, SAFRING, which is the organisation at University of Cape Town that administers the ringing. It says inform SAFRING, and then it's got the unique number on the ring. There's all different ring sizes. They'll have a different sequence of letters and numbers on it, and that's the number that you should take down accurately, and then you submit that to SAFRING. You can just Google it, and the contact details of SAFRING would come up, and it's that information that would get back. And say one of our birds was found, maybe flown into a window, or cats caught it or something like that, we'll get an email from UCT telling us what happened to this bird or where it was found.
And then for members of the public, we were speaking about this earlier, like for those who are overseas, we have a dock-cap bulbul, which is an incredibly common bird. If a member of the public, you spoke about, member of the public sees a bird that has ringing in it, and just for the sake of the overseas listening public, I know they call this banding overseas, just in case you're wondering what ringing is. You speak about submitting the data to SAFRING and that type of thing, but is there value in just the normal birds, or would it just be certain species? Every time you see a ring, do you submit it, or is it just certain birds?
Yes, no, all birds. We don't selectively choose the birds which we take out of the nets. We want to get a sample of the birds in the area. So depending again on how many of us are ringing, how many birds we can process comfortably, and that the birds aren't kept in the bags or for too long. We would process those, but all the species. It's whether it's a common bulbul, whether it's a one of the more rarer birds that's not seen in the area, we would do them all and get a cross section. The birds vary from region to region, with geographical variances and the subspecies, so they're all important, and we want the data back on recaptures across the board.
Well, you speak about the data. What role do you feel that this information plays in conservation? You're speaking about, how many years have you been doing this for now?
10 years I've been doing it.
10 years. So, how does the data from ringing or banding birds, how does that actually help in terms of conservation?
Well, first of all, it's a record of the species in the area. Certainly, I've learned more in the forested areas that we're catching species that people don't have on the bird lists for that area. So that's the first thing. We're learning how long do birds live? The different sizes, different species, different families. We don't know exactly how long all these different birds live and in different areas. So that's an important part of it. And then obviously by putting the rings on, it's the movement of the birds. You've got your resident, your territorial birds that will stay. Do they stay in one territory? Do they maintain their territory throughout their life? Or do they move 1 kilometer away, 10 kilometers away? And that's the information we're getting back. An example would be we ring crowned hornbill chicks in Westville. somebody's got a nest box up in the garden, and each year in December they give us a call. We go through and ring it. This week I got an email from Saffron to say one of those chicks has now been found in Kloof. So those birds are spreading out. It's that one little nest box is actually producing 3 or 4 chicks a year, which is, repopulating that area. So those are the most important things on it. And as you'll know, as birders know, it's very hard to identify some of the LBJs, as we call them. Harder to identify birds, and some of it's only by by sizes of wing measurements, or it can be the shape of the feathers in the primary feathers, where there's a notch and at which position for some of the migratory warblers. It helps from identification. And then, for me, as I mentioned earlier, education is a big part of it as well.
And you spoke about that. What is this? Obviously, it's quite an expensive thing to do. Quite an expensive way in terms of conservation. What sort of costs are you looking to get involved in this? And from your side, how do you cover these costs? Is there ways that you cover these costs?
For somebody who's wanting to become a bird ringer, there is the initial setup costs. A lot of it you can make on your own, whether it's the poles, the stakes, that sort of thing. You can just buy at your local hardware and get them cut up and make it. The expense comes in. The rings aren't particularly expensive. They sort of vary between 1 rand to 3 rand or 5 rand a piece for the bigger rings. But you have to get all the ring sizes. It's no good catching birds. You've only got a sample of the rings. You need all of it. And those you can only order once you are a certified licensed ringer. A member of the public can't just go and order rings from Saffron, and they're the only people you can order those from in Southern Africa. So it's very controlled from that point of view. And the same with the nets. You can't just go out and buy the nets. Unfortunately, we have to import them, so that is probably the most expensive part of it. So personally, I get my nets through Ecotones in Poland. We used to have a supplier in South Africa, but no longer. So those can add up. That's with the exchange rates. You're probably looking at 1,500 to 2,000 rand a net.
Sure. How many meters would that be?
The nets vary. You can get from 6 meters up to I think it's 21 meters. Sure. And you want a sort of a cross section of nets as well to wind your way through trees and so on. And so that is an expensive part of it. A lot of areas you ring, you take care of your nets. You don't put them up next to thorn trees. You can see the nets behind us. You do have damage to the net sometimes with animals. Again, if you ring in reserves like this, you might have encounters with zebra or kudu, giraffe. You do need to replace the nets every now and then. But they can last a number of years.
And then in terms of, I know birding is one of the fastest growing hobbies in the world, but ringing, are there people coming through and ringing? How strong is ringing at the moment, especially let's in the Southern African context? Are there new people coming through? What does the future look like for ringing?
We certainly could do with more ringers around the country or around the region, Southern Africa. I'd say at the moment there's probably only 100 or so active ringers.
Sure.
And some of those ringers might only be submitting 50, 100 birds a year. So the more ringers you can get, the better, to be spread out, because you want to see where these birds are going. So we could certainly do with more ringers coming through. It does take a bit of effort and time to do the setup and the planning and the data capturing, but it's one of the most rewarding things I've ever done. To see the birds up close and getting to know them so well like that, but also for other people, seeing people join us do it. Like you said, some people find it a bit controversial, but then when you see the wonder in people's faces and the pleasure they get out of seeing these birds up close and actually being able to touch it or release them, see them going free, it's very special. It's one of probably the thing I enjoy the most is sharing it with other people and actually showing them what it's all about.
And let's talk about it. Someone listening to this, and this might be very different overseas to South Africa, but let's look from a Southern African perspective. Somebody says, this is something they'd like to get involved in. What would that process look like? So they listen to this and they'd like to get involved. How would they move from, just having an interest in doing this to actually qualifying to be able to do this themselves?
All right, so the first thing you got to do is find a licensed ringer in your area that that they're happy for you to join them, and then you come out and you spend your time with them, because you've got to be found competent in all areas. It's not just the physical handling of the birds. It's with the equipment. It's the accuracy with the data. You've got to get the whole spectrum of it. So you would find a person that you can do your ringing with, and the guideline: 50 different species, 500 birds that you should have ringed with another ringer. But again, the ringers that you are training with, they will assess your competency as you're going along. You might find somebody doesn't have the patience or you've got to be gentle with the birds, but you've also got to be firm with the birds, if that makes sense. So you'd spend that time. It's the putting up the nets can be tricky. So all of us, the ringers, have our own systems that work for us and how we do it, which poles we use, and so it's time. It's spending time out there. It's different ringing a little sunbird, a collared sunbird at say 8 or 9 grams, to ringing a terraco or a dove even. You've got to pick up your techniques on each of the different species as you go along, and some of the birds do make quite a bit of noise, and that can stress some people out. You think, oh, you're hurting it, but there's no harm coming to your bird. It's just voicing its displeasure of being held. So yeah, it takes time, depending, of course, how regularly that the person is that you're training with goes out. It can take a year or two to get that training done. But if I'm training somebody, it's not just me that will then approve them. It would be a recommendation through to SAFRing, and then ideally another 2 or 3 ringers to be able to assess that person separately and to see if they find them competent as well. And then it's getting out there and yeah.
Oh, James, I really appreciate it. Thanks for your time. I really appreciate you being on the show. It's been good chatting to you, and yeah, I look forward to coming and doing this again in the future. So it was a lot of fun. Thanks
Excellent.
so much.
Yeah, we look forward to sharing it again, and time to go and check the nets again.
We are proud to be working in association with Wildbooks to help get all the best birding resources into your hands at a great price. If you would like to support the Birding Life project and the resources that we are putting out, please click on the link in either the comment section of this podcast or in our social media posts. Your support helps us to improve and hopefully make a bigger impact. Be sure to head over to our website, www.thebirdinglife.com, and check out all the exciting resources that we have on our website, including our exciting forum section to connect you with the world of birding, birders, and exciting birds out there. Do not forget to follow The Birding Life on Instagram and Facebook. We really appreciate everyone that takes the time to interact with these accounts. Be sure to check out Birdlasser and download the app on either iOS or Android, and keep a life list while playing your part in social conservation, as well as Swarovski Optic, one of the world's leading producers of binoculars, and spotting scopes. So until next time, be blessed and happy birding.